Okay, I'm going to read my famous introduction that most people probably know by heart. Welcome to the 11th Annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment Virtual Conference presented by Northeastern State University. Session today is one of the 60-hour online sessions we have to Friday, February 14th. I'm Bob Hales. I have the honor to be your moderator. As a reminder, all of our sessions are indeed closed captioned. This one will be too. You just got to click on the closed caption icon on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. This is going to be an interesting session. Points are pointless. The search for grading Nirvana. And we have with us Matthew Roberts from Grand Valley State University in that state up north, as we say in Ohio. So, Matthew, let me turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to present as part of your conference. This is a wonderful opportunity. Although I have to say, when there's that much snow on the ground here in Michigan in the middle of winter, getting away physically to a conference somewhere else can be a very appealing option. But, you know, I'm safely ensconced in my office for the moment. So let me say a little bit about myself. At Grand Valley, I wear two hats, really. Full-time, I work as an instructional designer in our e-learning and emerging technologies group. And, you know, if you ask 10 instructional designers what they do, you'll probably get 11 answers. It's a job which varies greatly across institutions, and we're actually in a position where we're going to be ramping up a lot of what we do with online and hybrid education, and probably we're going to see our jobs changing a little bit even from what they have been. But in addition to that, I work as a adjunct professor of political science here at Grand Valley as well. And I've been teaching one class every semester for almost the entire time that I've been here, since 2011. And that's sort of the limit of what they let staff teach. And that's good because I don't know how many of you are faculty, but my experience is teaching expands to fill all available time like a goldfish. So if I had more than one class, I think I would go mad. So when I'm at conferences, frequently what I present are things that give me an opportunity to dig in and investigate things that are interesting to me, because I'm on the alternate academic path, as people are starting to call it. I don't have a lot of opportunity to do research in my own discipline of political science. So I've been using opportunities to learn more about pedagogy and to improve my own practice as well. Today, what I want to talk about is something that's not just something I'm interested in, but it's something that I've become very passionate about, something that I care deeply about because I think it's integral to teaching and to teaching well. So I'm a philosopher by nature as well as by training. And, I usually like to start things with kind of the 10,000-foot view, if that's high enough up. Here I want to start, though, from a far more practical point, and that's really from the challenges that we face when it comes to teaching and the topic of grading. So I don't know how many of you are faculty, but even if you are not someone who's teaching right now, you've probably been in a circumstance in the past where you've been graded. So either from the point of view of being the one doing the grading or being the one graded, if you want to just in the chat, type kind of quickly what problems that you have experienced when it comes to grading. What challenges do we face? Or what problems have you encountered in the grading process? No, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. Let's do that. There we go. So what problems have you seen or have you encountered in the grading process? Okay, grading in a timely manner, says Ramona. Yep, I am suffering from that right now. I am way behind. Alyssa says time, yeah. Earlier than what is required. Making sure I'm not grading with bias, very important. Give a second for other people to chime in if they want. Everyone else is either typing. Oh, there we go. Giving feedback on common mistakes. Oh yeah, feedback. If I didn't have to give feedback on the work that I graded, I could grade so much faster. but unfortunately, feedback is a valuable and important thing when it comes to teaching. And we'll talk about that. Is the feedback helpful or is it being seen? Yeah, a lot of times we type out our feedback and we kind of just hope against all hope that the students actually are reading it. Yeah, and making it personalized. Amanda's right. Making it personalized takes so much time. Yeah, a student who admitted he never looked at what you wrote. Yeah, I've had students sort of incidentally admit that, but it takes a brave student to actually say, no, I didn't even look. But at the same time, the question is, what is the incentive for them to look? And that's something that we'll talk about. All right. So the fact is, problems with grading, especially time, as lots of people had said, time and other problems with grading are so common that, it's not hard to find jokes. And when it comes to the end of the semester and you're trying to avoid grading, you can find so many memes and tropes about the problems of grading. So let's see. Here's one, brace yourselves, the excuses are coming. So there's that. I seem stressed. Have you seen the 150 graded essays on my desk? I think my pile might be bigger at the moment. Become a teacher, they said, it will be fun, they said. And here I think is my favorite. Being a teacher is easy. It's like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire and you're on fire and everything is on fire and you're on fire. So, and the fact is, as faculty, as instructors, complaining about grading is kind of a standard things that we do. But I encountered a book several years ago now that made me sort of start from the point of view of, what are the problems with grading, but move on to the question of what can we really do about them. Linda Nilsson has written a number of different books, but she published a book called Specifications Grading in, I think it was fall of 2015. If it wasn't fall of 2015, it was fall of 2014. And the book starts by discussing the problems that most faculty, or most people who think about it, admit are there about grading. But what I like about the book is how she takes this conversation about problems and then morphs it into a conversation about what a perfect grading system would be like. So that book I mentioned is called Specifications Grading, Restoring Rigor, Motivating Students, and Saving Faculty Time. It's an excellent read. If you don't want to pick up a copy, check with your Center for the Improvement of Teaching and Learning, whatever it happens to be called on your campus. They very well might have a copy. But what I want to do is I want to go through 10 out of the 15 features that she identifies about a perfect grading system, and just to talk a little bit how those are related to the flaws that we experience in the grading process. So the first feature that she talks about is the idea that a perfect grading system should uphold high academic standards. It should actually make students achieve and do quality work. The problem is, we often, in our grading system, sacrifice rigor for student satisfaction. I know a lot of faculty in our business school who lament the fact that student evaluations are such a huge part of their evaluation process that they resist making changes to their teaching lest students actually sort of rebel against it. Second, grading really should reflect student learning outcomes, but in reality right now, grading really communicates nothing. And this is one of the things that actually sort of really hit home for me. If you had an employer come to you and talk to you about a student that you had last semester or a couple of semesters ago and said, okay, you gave them a B on their transcript. What does a B mean? For most faculty, there's really no way to translate a letter grade to an actual measure or indicator of what students learned. It's because the way in which most of us come up with grades are based upon creating a pile of points. Students get a few points here, a few points there, and at some point they get a big pile that happens to be enough for a B or a C or an A minus. But that's not connected at all to what students are supposed to be learning in their course. We also know that students are far too focused on their grades, and they take sometimes, from our perspective, problematic, but what are frequently rational steps to maximize the grade they receive while minimizing the amount of work they need to put in. Getting a grade becomes a strategic decision for a lot of students. A perfect system should also motivate students to excel, to not just do what they're able to do now, but to encourage them to grow and to accomplish more. The problem is there's at least one major feature of our grading systems that tends to depress students' desire to excel. Cheating, we could talk for a long time about academic dishonesty. The problem is the way in which we do grading in most of our courses offers little incentive for high quality work, which really means that students will frequently take approaches that will get them the points that they need, especially when, at least in my class, for example, and I know for a lot of students at our institution, students are working 20, 30, 40 hours a week. They have multiple demands. And if they can find a way to cut corners, they will. Really, we should have a grading system that makes cheating more difficult or makes it less appealing, or both. So ideally, a perfect grading system should also reduce student stress. Students are under a great deal of pressure to get the grade that they need because they think it's a connection to future job prospects, financial well-being, especially in this day and age where the costs of higher education are so expensive. And when we provide unclear expectations to students about the kind of work that we require, they have quite legitimate anxiety about the work they need to produce. And it leads to a number of related problems: perceived loss of control over their academic success, and it's stress that can be very hard for them to eliminate. And we can't really ultimately take away all stress from the learning process, nor should we. But ideally, we should have a grading system that can give students a greater sense of control over their academic life, a clearer sense of our expectations, and give them more choice and volition. Okay, 7, really, we want a system which makes students feel like they're in control of how they're going to succeed. And the secret there is providing clear expectations and a greater choice to students. And a lot of people, when it comes to student evaluations, they become concerned about the way in which students receiving negative grades can then show up in student evaluations as negative feedback that's often seen as without basis. But if students have greater sense of ownership of their grades, in theory, it can help reduce negative teaching evaluations, since students will feel less of a need to punish a professor they see as in arbitrary control of their future success. Many faculty have a history of conflicts over grades. Most of us at some point have had a student come to us, ask us to justify why we took off a certain number of points, and work very hard to argue they should get those points back. Point grubbing is what it's usually called. Really, a perfect grading system would reduce our need to sort of have these conversations and these conflicts, and would promote positive behaviors like students planning ahead and producing work that is at the maximum of their ability. 9, and this is where things become very practical in terms of time, that many people are indicating is a problem. There's a lot of time that goes into grading, and frequently a lot of that time comes into our need to justify why we're not giving students 100%, why we're taking off a point here, why we're taking off a point there. A perfect system would reduce that need. And then finally, the last one that I want to talk about, and this ties back into something that was mentioned in the chat, is that right now students have frequently little incentive to look at the feedback that we take so long in providing them. We want a system where that feedback should be useful, not just, letting us check off a checkbox where, we're communicating information to students, but really where students can take that information and can then use it as a way to improve their knowledge, improve their success for the future. Feedback that we provide should be a fuel for them to improve how they're doing. Okay, so those are 10 different reasons. You might have your own thoughts about which ones seem most appealing. For me, these are the ones that really hit home for me. The idea that grading isn't really tied to learning, that in some cases, the way in which we grade in the grading system actually works against students' desire or interest in learning. So in her book, Nelson lays out these, but then she goes on from there. And looking at this and reading through this book, it really reinforced something for me, which is education. And I'm sorry if this sounds kind of obvious to anyone, but at some point this kind of really hit home for me. When it comes to the learning process, the center of it all should be learning. And in the courses that we teach, in our interactions with students, if we're doing things that point away from learning or distract from learning, then we really need to find a way to address those and recenter learning back, recenter education back on learning. So specifications grading. What I want to do now is provide just sort of a brief overview of the major components of Nielsen's specifications grading system. If any of you are familiar with the concept of mastery grading or standards-based grading or contract grading, there's a lot of overlap here. And I apologize if my sort of overview of all this doesn't necessarily identify how specifications grading is different from all those other things. This is something perhaps we can talk about if there's time. But the heart of specifications grading, or really the start of it all, is with learning objectives. Learning objectives, if you're not in the habit right now of making sure that you're identifying learning objectives for your course, for the work that you're doing in your course, that's one of the first and most basic things that an instructional designer will tell you need to do. And that's because if at the end of our course, we want students to have learned something, whatever that might be, we need to be clear about what it is you're going to have learned. There's an approach called understanding by design, sometimes colloquially referred to as backward design, which talks about planning academic courses by starting at the end, which is the learning that's supposed to happen. So you start with learning objectives. Hopefully most of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It's one of the most common ways of looking at and thinking about the kinds of tasks that students do in the process of coming to master content. The most common part of Bloom's taxonomy is the taxonomy of the cognitive domain, things related to knowledge, but he actually has other scales. And this is actually, I think, yeah, this is the old Bloom's taxonomy. It was revised, around 20 years ago now. That seems like it shouldn't be that long ago, but and they swapped around the top two levels. That's not important for our purposes, but what's key to note is that learning objectives come in different levels. At the very base of this particular diagram are ones that we could call ones related to knowledge. So students being able to define or describe or name certain key concepts. Those are fairly low level cognitive tasks, but as you go up this light bulb, usually this is presented as a pyramid, you get more complex cognitive tasks involving analysis, synthesis, evaluation. So for specifications grading, you need to start with your learning objectives. So after identifying that, Nielsen in her book next emphasizes that if we're going to improve the grading situation, we really need to eliminate one of the most pernicious problems in the way that we grade and the way that we structure grading systems in our classes. And that is the idea of partial credit. Partial credit, like I said a few moments ago, not only makes things difficult for faculty because we end up trying to justify and spend lots of time justifying why we take off points. Partial credit is a disincentive to students to do quality work. And it all goes back to the fact that the way in which we grade basically becomes a numbers game. Students realize that if they want that C, they need a certain percentage of points, a certain number of points. And it doesn't matter where those points come from. So if they can do well on a couple assignments, but do poorly on some others and have it all average out, that's good enough. That's not a grading system that focuses or emphasizes learning. So partial credit, and we'll talk about how to eliminate partial credit in a moment. Part of the problem is if we get rid of partial credit, that can seem really harsh. How do we make that a system that's actually student and learning centered and is fair? Well, the secret is we need to make sure that students have a solid grasp on what they need to do to show mastery. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with the concept of rubrics, the idea of using a form that helps identify or justify the grade that students receive on an assessment. Well, when it comes to specifications grading, Nielsen suggests that as much as possible, the assessments in your course should basically be not A, B, C, D, E, F. They shouldn't be 100%, 99%, whatever. They should boil down to pass and no pass. Basically a one-level rubric. And work either is passing, meaning it meets the objectives that you've established, or it doesn't. Now, a couple of things here. Behind this is Nielsen's concept of specifications. To make sure that students understand what they're supposed to do, you provide them with a very clear and detailed set of specifications for the assignment. So a description of what you're looking to see in content, what you're looking to see in the way in which it's formatted, and spelling all that out so that students in advance can know what kind of work is going to earn a passing score. Now, passing is not perfect. Passing means, it sounds bad to say, but good enough or acceptable. And usually that equates to sort of what we would recognize as B-level work, or 80%. So also it's important to note that this is not pass-fail grading. A fail would indicate that you've reached the end of the line. There's nothing to be done to improve things. But one of the philosophical principles behind specs grading is that students should have a number of opportunities to demonstrate their mastery and to improve. In some situations, it makes sense to add another level of distinction, which frequently is labeled something like progressing. Giving a student a score of progressing would indicate that they made substantial, meaningful attempts at completing the work or mastering the content. The main reason for adding this distinction then is to provide a meaningful opportunity for students to receive formative feedback, which can actually then help them improve how they've done. Students still need to earn a passing score, but when you give them a progressing score, it allows you to give them a signal that they're on the right path and that using the feedback you provide them, they'll have what they need to go from progressing to a pass. Usually in my courses, a score of no pass then is given when students submit late work, where they've done a really superficial effort, or simply they haven't done a serious attempt to meet the specifications. And for many specs graders, giving a student a score of no pass, it's still something they can improve, but usually there's some sort of cost or penalty involved in doing so, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Many specifications graders have also adopted a slightly more complex scale, usually using this for larger or more complex assignments. EMRN is one common way it's identified. That stands for excellent, meets expectations, needs revisions, or is not accessible. Mainly, the difference here is that it adds a level of excellence where you can recognize work that is truly above and beyond what you would normally expect. And that excellent achievement then could, in theory, become part of the kind of requirements you set out for students. So for example, if a student is working to get an A, they might be required to receive excellent scores a certain number of times. To help make this a little bit clearer, I give my students this document, which lays out what those four things are and what they look like. So something that meets expectations. It's not perfect. That's the important thing to note, is that it's not perfect, but it meets what I want to see from the work that you're submitting. There's nothing that's majorly wrong about it, but then you jump over to the R and the N, and you can see that things are different there. So a score of R indicates that there might be something incomplete, or that there are significant gaps that need to be improved for me to know that you really have mastered the content and met the learning objectives. And then you can see that N sort of matches up with what I said about very low quality work, usually work that has been intentionally submitted as a poor quality. The students who started, an hour before it was due, or simply are trying to quickly cross off a checkbox. So another key important concept in specifications grading, and this is common to this system as well as things like mastery grading, is that the learning environment is there to provide students as many opportunities as practical to demonstrate that they have learned the content and mastered the material, mastered the learning objectives. The emphasis is upon encouraging hard work and taking the time to actually submit work that meets the requirements. For most assessments, that includes some concept of revisions, where if the student submits work that receives a passing score or needs revisions, they can redo it. And the important thing to note here then is taking into account the feedback that you've provided. There's an incentive for them to actually look at the feedback. And then once they have done that, in theory, they could meet and get that passing score. A lot of courses that are based on specifications grading include I guess the best way to refer to it is a token economy. Not every faculty member calls these tokens. That is what Nielsen says, but they're an administrative way to incentivize good metacognitive behaviors. So in my courses, for example, students start with 5 tokens, and they can use them in a number of different ways. In a couple of slides, I'll show you a snippet from my syllabus where I lay out what some of those options are. But for example, if students need to submit work late after the due date, they can receive an extension by way of a token. I don't worry about figuring out whether their reasons for an extension are justified, whether they've had too many relatives die, that certainly they can't be telling the truth. They've got the tokens. If that's what they want to use it for, it's their right within the course. But once you've used up your tokens, they're gone. So you need to be strategic about how to use them and balance the work you need to do or put off with other things that might go on. So really, up to this point, I've only talked about individual assessment items, a paper, an assignment, maybe an exam. But the heart of specifications grading is really about how individual assessments and learning experiences fit together. Some of you may be familiar with a learning design strategy called a la carte assessment, where kind of like a restaurant menu, students can pick and choose what they'll work on to complete a course. I did this for a long time in my American government intro course. Students were required to complete a certain number, say 500 points worth of written work, but they could choose what kinds of assignments they submitted. Some were bigger and worth more points, some were less. Specifications grading is not about a la carte assessment. It's all about the way in which all those separate assessments work together and build to help show the students have achieved mastery. Nilsson talks about 2 different ways to package these things together. So the first thing is what she calls a module. A module, or modules, I suppose we should say, because usually in a course that has them, there are multiple. These are packages of learning experiences that are designed to be done in a sequence. So there might be a few modules at the start that provide foundational knowledge, groundwork knowledge for your students, and then there are ones later on that build upon that once they've mastered those skills. It's a way to include an element of scaffolding in the progress of the course. Bundles, then, are not progressive or sequential, but they are packages of learning experiences that can be done in any given order. So frequently bundles will put together different kinds of assignments. So maybe a short-term reflection reading along with some homework assignments and something else. The idea then would be to design a course where you have a variety of bundle options or modules, and students can choose from them as they determine how they're going to move through the course and demonstrate their mastery. One thing that I cannot very easily off the top of my head offer is a good example of what that might look like in any random academic discipline. But if you do get the specifications grading book, a large portion of the last half of the book is actually Nilsson laying out examples that she's gotten from faculty who have been using this method and showing how they set up their courses across a wide range of academic disciplines. So the final component of specifications grading really involves what I consider the real nitty-gritty of our institutional role as educators, and that's assigning a final grade. As we talked about, specifications grading, students complete individual assessments that are, as much as possible, pass or no pass or pass progressing. But how does a bunch of those different assessments turn into a final letter grade? How do you decide whether a student has gotten an A, a B, a C? Nilsson lays out 2 different strategies. The first is students, when you phrase it this way, grades ranging from F up to A, presuming a normal scale like that, students can earn higher grades by demonstrating mastery of more learning objectives. So for example, as you go through all the learning objectives for the course, you might identify some that are key, some that are basic, that students, if they're going to even just pass your course with a D, they need to get these. If students don't get these when they leave the class, it's been a failure, not just in a grade sense, but in a failure of learning. So as students then go higher up, they'll have met more of those learning objectives. So back at the beginning, I talked about the concern about grades not reflecting actual learning. Here's where that would be different. I mean, if a future employer came to me and said, so-and-so got a B in your class, what does that mean? In a specifications grading course, I could actually say, pull out the syllabus and say, okay, well, to have a grade of B in this class, students actually showed a mastery of these 10 learning objectives. So I'm confident that your potential hire actually met those. Okay. The other way of coming to a final grade is to demonstrate mastery of harder learning objectives. We talked about Bloom's taxonomy and how you have some cognitive tasks that are sort of easier and some that are more complex. You could build that into your grading system so that a student who gets a B or an A has done cognitively more demanding work than students who have earned a D or a C. Now, ideally, these aren't separate strategies, and you would use them together so that a student who has earned an A has done not just more work, but they've done harder work. This is kind of a casual aside here. I'm not going to say too much about, well, I'm not going to say anything really about universal design for learning. But if you're familiar with this design practice, specifications grading works very well with UDL, especially with the blue column and the purple column. I mean, all of them, really providing multiple avenues for students to engage with and demonstrate their mastery of content. Thing to note, Nilsson's book, it's not presented in a way that works from really a student-centered or student-centric approach. She really does approach it from the point of view of faculty and making a better grading system, but there is a symbiosis between UDL and this concept. So that's the theory about specifications grading. What does that look like in practice? I can speak most specifically to my application of this set of principles to a course that I teach here at Grand Valley every semester, Political Science 206, American Constitutional Foundations. It's a course which brings in a lot of students who are not political science majors. Most of them are actually education students, and it exposes them to the decisions made by the United States Supreme Court as a way to come to a better understanding of what our political system and our Constitution is all about. What I'm showing you here, I'm showing for two reasons. One, because this is probably the easiest encapsulation of the requirements for final letter grades in my course. During the first week of the semester, and actually during what you see there on the first line, that Getting Started module, that's what students do during the first week. Students are asked to complete an assignment that I call a learning blueprint, which asks them to go through a number of different aspects of their life related to learning and to think about what this semester is going to look like for them. So for example, they basically do a SWOT analysis, if you're familiar with that from the world of business and project management. I asked them to identify the threats to their learning. I mean, do they have a 40-hour-a-week job, which is going to mean that they have to stick their learning in the cracks available in their schedule? Do they have young children that they need to take care of? What's going to get in their way? And part of that assignment then is looking at these requirements and at the start of the semester identifying what they're going to target. Most students, I don't think, begin a semester thinking about what grade they're going to earn. They just end up getting what they hope is best. Maybe, well, I mean, take that back. Most A students probably go into a semester thinking they're going to get an A and wanting an A. But one of the things I do mention to students is that think about all the different things that are going to occupy your time and your attention this semester. You might not need to get an A. A B might be enough for all that you need given your competing demands. So on the left, the rows represent different kinds of requirements. The columns represent the different grade levels. And then this is also then a handout that I provide to students that they can use as a checklist to make sure that they have been getting their passing scores. So finishing the first week of the semester, getting a pass, they can cross off the Getting Started module. There are 2 foundation modules that build in some basic knowledge. Then actually right now in my class, we are in the second of those 8 case law modules. So those first 3 rows represent sort of the content of the course. And then below that are different projects and assignments that they have to then complete. But you'll notice that there is choice built in. So for example, at the D level, there are a lot of assignments that students are not required to complete if they're choosing to earn a D. As they go up the scale, there are some more assignments, and those checkboxes that start showing up only for the B's and the A's, those are in specific some assignments that actually do tap into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy and are harder to accomplish. So that's what my course looks like. We can always jump back to this slide if someone has a question about it. Thank you. Yeah, presuming that Linnea is talking about this slide, she says, a really cool tool. This is actually just a table in Microsoft Word. So, but I'll show you something else in a moment that hopefully will look even better. So in my syllabus and then also on the course website, I talk about opportunities for tokens. I mentioned that a moment ago. So you'll see that a token can be exchanged for a 24-hour extension. Let's see, this is actually last semester. I've changed a couple of these things. So one of the things that I do is if students do receive one of those highlighted in red, no pass or not accessible grades on something, they still can revise it, but they have to submit a token. So there's an incentive there to actually complete work that is decent the first time around rather than doing a blow-off effort and then thinking they could just fix it later on or skate by on partial credit. There is some flexibility. Students who do keep a certain number of tokens can end up skipping or passing certain requirements, although I do place restrictions upon how many and how that comes into the actual calculation of their grade. Okay, Linnea asks about how you track the tokens and passes. I'll actually show you in a moment. I'll use my actual sort of live system to show it to you. So yeah, the paperwork, keeping track of things ends up being one of the things you need to focus on to make a system work well. Just a couple of comments about this overall before I sort of share nitty gritty. Since adopting specifications grading, I've actually only taught online courses. I said earlier that I'm an adjunct who teaches one class, and I'm teaching the same class each semester. But teaching this in an online setting, I found does present some challenges. The combination of online and specifications grading. I've found, for example, that you need to provide a lot of clear explanation to students, and that's true across the board. You always have to do that. But it can take a while for students to catch on, and I find that students will demonstrate the smile and nod phenomenon very substantially, meaning you ask them if they understand it, and they will smile and nod and say yes. And then usually somewhere about 3 weeks before the end of the semester, it'll be clear that they don't understand. They'll say they get it before they actually really do get it. Even when we're well into the system, they can be disbelieving about how it works. There are no points at all in my class. There are 0 points. There's never an assignment where I tell them how many points they got. Unfortunately, things are done through Blackboard, which can't help talk about points. So I'll have students talk about points, but no, points don't matter. And one of the ways I've handled some of these problems is I actually do have metacognitive assignments that get students to think about the grading system, like that learning blueprint that I talked about. I want to be forthright. Usually I do get a few negative comments. These are not from the fall semester, the ones I'm going to show you. They are from last winter. I just forgot to update these slides and go back to my evaluations. It's hard to tease out with any student evaluation what the problem is. In an online class, in mine, I face the challenge that a lot of people think an online class is supposed to be easy, and many students have had poorly designed online classes that had very little real work, which means that students frequently complain about the level of work because they're just being asked to do actual work. Let's see. One student said, the grading system for this class has detracted from my learning because it isn't based off a point total or percentage, but off of our professor's subjective grading requires you to complete a certain amount of work to receive a grade. There are lots of things we could dissect there. It makes sense that you should do a certain amount of work to receive a grade. Beyond that, this is a system that personally I think is actually less subjective than it would be otherwise. But this is clearly a student who relies upon the concept of piling up a number of points to succeed in class, and this system gets in the way of that. The course load was extremely high. If you want to get a good grade, again, I don't think the workload was high, but in theory, if you want a good grade, you should be doing a lot of work. I had another student say, stick to point-based cumulative grading schemes. Inconsistent criteria only serve to confuse and fluster students. I'm not quite sure what they meant by inconsistent. I know that students can get flustered, but lots of things can fluster students. I didn't really change anything over the course of the semester. So I think obviously anytime you use an aspect of teaching practice that is new to students, you're going to get a certain amount of resistance. Um, while there were negative comments, there have been very specifically positive comments, and I appreciate that. I appreciate its grading system. I've never encountered it, and I was hesitant about it at first, but it allowed me to succeed at the level I wanted to be. So definitely a student who saw that their success was more in their control than it would be otherwise. Kind of hard to understand the grading system, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. I was not familiar with the token system until this class, and honestly, I think that every class should have this. It's almost like a motivator for me to try and not use them, which unfortunately I had to already. Oops. And that's definitely why the token system is part of this whole way, because it's a way to encourage positive behaviors on the part of students. Last thing I want to say, sort of evaluation-wise, Nilsson places a lot of emphasis on this system making things less stressful for students. I don't know that I've been able to measure that or see that, but I think that's because student stress is a complicated thing, and even just change in and of itself causes stress. Okay, so getting to the question that Linnea asked about keeping track of things. The problem is most learning management systems, and here at Grand Valley we use Blackboard, they do a very poor job of helping you do this kind of grading because they weren't designed for it. They were designed for the create a pile of points and do some math on it. This is what my grade center looks like in Blackboard. You can see I've passes, and there are points in one column. They're not real, don't worry about it. That was an assignment they're not technically graded on. I can make it work all right in Blackboard, but actually in the student view, it's even worse, because the student view in Blackboard is just this list of all these things one after another. The problem is in specifications grading, assignments are actually connected to each other. They are tied to each other. So how you do in one impacts other things. What I've done actually is I've created my own tool. And it started basically with an interactive version of that checklist that I showed you in Microsoft Word. This document, basically students have access to this system, which shows them where they're at. And I've actually turned this for my purposes into a general purpose, a general purpose grade book. And actually I'm going to jump out of my presentation right now and try to pull up. Let's see if I can do this successfully. You should now see the mountain again. I need a browser window. I'm going to pull up my system, and then I'm going to hopefully click the button, which makes it all FERPA safe. Let's see. So I'm going to go in here, and there we go. Okay, so I'm going to put this on the screen now. So this is my actual course right now with fake student pictures and fake student names. This is one view. I'm not going to poke through all of it, but one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show you some of the things that Linnea was asking about. So for example, tracking tokens. Every student, I can go in and take a look at that student by themselves. And this system then knows how many tokens they started with, their current number of tokens, and keeps track of the tokens that they've earned. It is possible in some circumstances to earn bonus tokens, and then ones that they've used. And then let's see if I jump over. This view then represents kind of my behind the scenes version of that checklist, where I can actually then come in and let me see if I can find where a student used a token. Oh no, I guess that student didn't use any, they just earned some, okay. But for each of these assignments then I can come in and I can indicate how many tokens a student used on that. I can put in a reason, and then there's a number of other different pieces of information that I can track about it. And I can also then come in and I can take a look at a particular assignment for everybody. So let me actually just narrow this a little bit. So it keeps track of extensions for assignments. And then let's see, I guess nobody used a token here, but this system then, I've started using it more and also giving students access to it as a way to help them understand the connection between what they've accomplished and where they need to get to be successful with their final grade. You're welcome. I'm looking at the clock. At least I was, then it disappeared. What time is it? It is through 2:53 Central Time. I have a couple of other slides where I talk about some big picture kinds of things, challenges and things that I keep thinking about. I don't necessarily need to run through those. I'd be happy to actually simply turn and answer questions that anyone might have. Bob has told me I have 2 minutes, so. Thank you. Yeah. There is a lot to consider. I mean, I do want to throw up one slide here because I think this is an important point that I want to make. If grading is as flawed as it appears to be, I mean, if we buy Nelson's explanation of the problems that there are in the grading system, the fact is, if our system is that flawed, then it's counterproductive to grade the way that we do it. We actually end up shortchanging our students because what we do actually ends up working in many cases against learning. We're not using a system that helps students want to learn. And it's not fulfilling an institutional responsibility that we have because we're not actually certifying that students have learned anything. When we provide a final grade, it is something that employers, families, cultural institutions, are supposed to be able to rely upon about the knowledge that students have learned. And if we can't actually say students have learned what they're supposed to, I think we're not definitely putting learning at the center of the learning process, and we're escaping a fundamental role that we need to play. You're welcome, Candy. Thanks for being present.
Wow, Matthew, that was really good.
Oh, well, thank you, Bob.
I think everybody really learned a lot from that.
Yeah, if the best thing I can say is if you're interested, pick up a copy of the book or simply take yourself to your favorite internet search engine and type in specifications grading. You'll find a bunch of resources. Here at Grand Valley, we actually have a math faculty member named Robert Talbert, who is a big proponent of this, and he actually has blogged fairly substantially about this and about his grading systems for his math courses, and you'll no doubt run into those blog posts if you do a search for specifications grading. I would love to blog more, but I always lack the time to do so.
Okay. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate your time, Matthew.
Well, thank you, Bob.
And we'll end the session, and we got one more today coming up in a few minutes. See you then.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.